Their Majesties remained at Fontainebleau until November 14th. The King of Saxony had reached Paris the day before. The Emperor went nearly all the way from Fontainebleau to Paris on horseback, repaired on his arrival to the Élysée Palace. The two monarchs seemed very much united and went out together nearly every day. One morning very early, they left the Tuileries on foot, each with a single attendant. I was with the Emperor. They followed the river bank and went in the direction of the Jena Bridge, the works of which were being pushed with great activity. They had reached the Place de la Révolution, where from 50 to 60 persons were assembled with the intention of accompanying the two sovereigns. This group began to annoy the Emperor, but some police agents dispersed them. On arriving at the bridge, His Majesty carefully examined the works, and finding something to criticize in the construction, he summoned the architect, who found the criticism just, although before he would acknowledge it, the Emperor was obliged to talk a good deal and go over the same explanations many times. Then His Majesty, turning towards the King of Saxony, said to him, "You see, cousin, the master's eye is needed everywhere." "Yes," replied the King of Saxony, "and especially even eyes so practiced as your Majesty's." Almost as soon as we were at Fontainebleau, I noticed that the Emperor was constrained and preoccupied whenever he found himself with his august spouse. The same embarrassment was visible in the countenance of the Empress. This restraint and mutual observation soon became so apparent as to be remarked upon by everybody. Hence it followed that the sojourn at Fontainebleau was extremely wearisome and sad. At Paris, the presence of the King of Saxony caused a diversion, but the Emperor seemed more uneasy than ever. Everyone exhausted himself in conjectures. For me, I knew only too well what to think. The Emperor looked more and more thoughtful daily until November 3rd arrived. On that day, the dinner was more silent than I had ever seen it. The Empress had wept all day long, and to conceal her pallor and the redness of her eyes as much as possible, she wore a white hat tied under her chin, the front of which hid her forehead altogether. The Emperor's eyes were lowered almost continuously. From time to time, convulsive movements disturbed his countenance, and if he occasionally raised his eyes, it was to cast a stealthy glance at the Empress, which plainly betrayed his profound affliction. The officers on duty, motionless as statues, observed this somber and painful scene with curious anxiety, and throughout the repast, which was served only for form's sake, since their Majesties touched nothing, all that was heard was the uniform sound of plates brought and taken away again, varied sadly by the monotonous voice of the kitchen officers and the tinkling produced by the Emperor in striking his knife mechanically against the side of his glass. Once only His Majesty broke the silence with a heavy sigh, followed by the words, "What time is it?" addressed to one of the officers, a question without motive or result for the Emperor, for he either never heard or seemed not to hear the response. He rose from the table almost immediately, and the Empress followed him with slow steps, her handkerchief over her mouth, as if to suppress her sobs. Coffee was brought, and according to custom, a page presented the tray to the Empress that she might pour it. But the Emperor took it himself, poured the coffee into the cup, and put the sugar into it to melt, still looking at the Empress, who remained standing as if stupefied. He drank and returned the whole service to the page. Afterwards, he showed by a sign that he wished to be alone, and closed the door of the salon behind him. I stayed without and sat down beside the door. Soon there was no one left in the dining room but one of the prefects of the palace, who walked up and down with folded arms, foreboding, like me, some terrible event. At the end of some minutes, I heard shrieks. I rushed forward. The Emperor opened the door quickly, looked, and saw nobody but us two. The Empress was on the floor, weeping and crying enough to break one's heart. "No, you will not do it. You do not want to kill me." The usher of the chamber had his back turned. I ran to him. He understood me and went out. His Majesty called in the person who was with me, and the door was closed again. I have since known that the Emperor told him to lift the Empress in order to carry her to her apartment. His Majesty said she had just had a violent nervous attack and that her situation called for the promptest attention. "Is there to be Aided by the emperor, raised the empress in his arms, and his majesty, taking a candle from the chimney piece, lighted Monsieur de B through a lobby ending at the private staircase which brought his apartments into communication with those of the empress. This extremely narrow staircase would not allow a man carrying such a burden to descend it without the risk of falling. Monsieur de B said as much to his majesty, who called the keeper of the portfolio, whose business it was to remain constantly at the door of the emperor's study, which opened on this staircase, and gave him the candle, which was no longer needed, as the lanterns had just been lighted. His majesty made the keeper go ahead, still holding the candle, and taking the empress by the legs, he brought her down safely with Mr. de B, and they reached the bedchamber in this fashion. Then the emperor rang for the women. When they came, he retired with tears in his eyes and giving every sign of keen emotion. The scene had so affected him that he was betrayed into making some remarks to Monsieur de B in a trembling and broken voice, which would have never issued from his lips under any other circumstance. Doubtless it needed an extreme distress to make his majesty acquaint Monsieur de B with the reason of her majesty's despair, to make him say to him that the interest of France and the imperial dynasty had done violence to his heart, that the divorce had become a deplorable, rigorous duty, but nevertheless a duty. Queen Hortense and Mr. Corvisart were soon with the empress, who passed a wretched night. On his part, the emperor did not sleep. He rose several times to go to inquire for himself how Josephine was. Throughout the entire night, his majesty never uttered a single word. I have never seen him in such affliction. Meanwhile, the king of Naples, the king of Westphalia, the king of Württemberg, and the queens and princesses of the imperial family were arriving in Paris to be present at the fêtes to be given to his majesty by the city, in rejoicing over the victories and the peace with Germany, as well as to celebrate the anniversary of the coronation. The session of the legislative body was also about to open. It was necessary that in the interval which divided the agitation of which I have just spoken from the day on which the act of divorce was to be signed, the empress should be present at all the ceremonies, all the fetes, that she should appear before immense crowds, while silence alone could bring some consolation for her woes. It was necessary that she should cover her face with rouge in order to conceal her pallor and the ravages of a month spent in torments and tears. What tortures! And how she must have cursed that elevation of which nothing now remained to her but its constraints. On the 3rd of December, their majesties went to Notre Dame. A Te Deum was chanted, after which the imperial cortege took up its march towards the palace of the legislative body, and the opening of the session took place with unusual magnificence. The emperor took his seat amid inexpressible enthusiasm. Never perhaps had his appearance called forth such storms of applause. For an instant the empress was less sad. She seemed to enjoy these evidences of affection for him who was about to cease to be her husband, but when he began speaking, she relapsed into her painful reflections. It was nearly 5 o'clock when the cortege re-entered the Tuileries. The imperial banquet was to be at 7:30. In the interval, there was a reception of ambassadors, after which the guests went into the gallery of Diana. At the banquet, the emperor wore his coronation costume and a plumed hat, which he never laid aside for an instant. He ate more than usual, in spite of the anxiety that seemed to agitate him. He looked all around and behind him, and was constantly making the grand chamberlain stoop down to receive an order that he never gave. The empress sat opposite him in the richest costume, a robe wrought in gold wire, covered with diamonds, but her face showed still more suffering than in the morning. On the emperor's right sat the king of Saxony in a white uniform with red lapels and collar richly embroidered in silver. He wore a false queue of prodigious length. Besides the king of Saxony was the king of Westphalia, Jerome Bonaparte, the tunic of white satin, and a belt loaded with pearls and diamonds, which came almost up to his arms. His neck was bare and white. He had no whiskers and very little beard. A collarette of magnificent lace falling back over his shoulders, and a toque of black velvet adorned with white feathers completed this costume, the freshest and the most gallant in the world. Next came the King of Württemberg, with his enormous paunch, which kept him away back from the table, and then the King of Naples in a dress so rich that it was almost extravagant, covered with crosses and stars, and playing with his fork without eating or drinking. On the right of the Empress was the Empress Mother, the Queen of Westphalia, the Princess Borghese, and Queen Hortense, pale like the Empress, but rendered more beautiful by sadness. Her face was in remarkable contrast with that of the Princess Pauline, who never perhaps had seemed gayer on that day. The toilette of the Princess Pauline was extraordinarily studied, but it did not enhance the charms of her person nearly as well as the simple but elegant dress of the Queen of Holland. The next day there was a magnificent fête at the Hôtel de Ville, at which the Empress displayed her usual grace and kindness. This was the last time she ever appeared in grand ceremony. Some days after all these rejoicings, the Viceroy of Italy, Eugène de Beauharnais, arrived. He learned from the Empress's own mouth the terrible measure which circumstances were about to render necessary. This confidence overwhelmed him. Troubled and despairing, he went to His Majesty, and as he could not believe what he had just heard, he asked the Emperor if it were true that the divorce must take place. The Emperor made a sign in the affirmative and held out his hand to his adopted son with a sorrowful expression. "Sire, permit me to leave you." "How?" "Yes, sire. The son of her who is no longer empress cannot remain viceroy. I will follow my mother in her retreat and console her." "Thou wilt leave me, Eugène, thou? And knowest thou not how imperative are the reasons which compel me to such a step? And if I obtain him, that son, the object of my dearest wishes, that son so necessary to me, who will take my place near him when I shall be absent? Who will act as a father to him if I die? Who will bring him up? Who will make a man of him?" There were tears in his eyes as he uttered these last words. Again, he took the hand of Prince Eugène, and drawing him to his breast, he embraced him tenderly. I could not hear the close of this interesting conversation. At last, the fatal day arrived. It was the 16th of December. The imperial family had reassembled in extremely ceremonious costumes. When the Empress entered in a very simple white robe without the least ornament, she was pale and calm and leaned on the arm of Queen Hortense, who was as pale and much more affected than her august mother. The Prince de Beauharnais was standing beside the Emperor, his arms crossed and trembling so violently that he seemed likely to fall at any moment. When the Empress had entered, Count Renaud de Saint-Angély read aloud the act of separation. This reading was listened to in profound silence. Every face was expressive of profound anxiety. The Empress seemed more calm than the others, although her cheeks were constantly furrowed with tears. She sat in an armchair in the middle of the salon, her elbow resting on a table. Queen Hortense stood beside her, sobbing. The reading of the act finished, and the Empress rose, dried her eyes, and in a voice that was almost firm, pronounced the words of adhesion. Then he sat down again in her armchair, took a pen from the hands of M. Renaud de Saint-Angély, and signed. Afterwards she withdrew, still supported by Queen Hortense. Prince Eugène went out at the same moment through the study, and his strength failing him, he fell down unconscious between the two doors. The usher of the study raised him and put him in charge of his aides-de-camp, who lavished on him all the attentions required by so painful a position. During this terrible ceremony, the Emperor did not say a word, did not make a gesture. He was as motionless as a statue, his eyes fixed and almost haggard. He was silent and gloomy all day long. In the evening, just as he had gone to bed, and while I was awaiting his last orders, the door opened suddenly, and I saw the Empress enter, her hair in disorder and her face very much drawn. Her aspect terrified me. Josephine, for she was no longer anything but Josephine, advanced with trembling steps towards the Emperor's bed. When nearly there, she stopped and cried in a heart-rending manner. She fell upon the bed, passed her arms around His Majesty's neck, and lavished on him the tenderest caresses. My emotion cannot be described. The emperor also began to weep. He sat up and pressed Josephine to his heart, saying, "Come, my good Josephine, be more reasonable. Come, courage, courage. I shall always be thy friend." Stifled by her sobs, the empress could not reply. Then there was a silent scene which lasted several minutes, during which their blended tears and sobs told more than the tenderest verbal expressions. At last his majesty, coming out of this prostration as from a dream, perceived that I was there and said, "Go out, Constant." In a voice altered by his tears, I obeyed and went into the adjoining salon. An hour later, I saw Josephine go back, still very sad, still in tears. She made me a kindly sign in passing. Then I re-entered the sleeping chamber to fetch away the candles, as I was accustomed to do every evening. And the emperor was as silent as the grave, and so buried in his bed that it was impossible for me to see his face. The next morning, when I went into the emperor's chamber, he did not say a word to me concerning the visit of the empress. But I found him suffering and depressed. Some badly stifled sighs issued from his breast. He did not speak while his toilette was being made, and as soon as it was over, he went into his cabinet. It was on that day that Josephine was to leave the Tuileries and go to Malmaison. All those whose duties did not detain them elsewhere were assembled under the vestibules to see once more this dethroned empress, whom all hearts followed into her exile. We looked at each other without daring to speak. Josephine appeared closely veiled, one arm over the shoulder of one of her ladies and the other holding a handkerchief to her eyes. There was a totally indescribable chorus of lamentations when this adored woman crossed the short space which separated her from the carriage. She got into it without casting a last look at the palace she was quitting forever. The blinds were instantly pulled down, and the horses went off like lightning. Some hours later, the emperor departed for Versailles. Chapter 12. The marriage of His Majesty with the Archduchess Marie Louise was the first step of the emperor in his new career. He flattered himself that it would be as glorious as that he had already traversed. But it was quite the reverse. Before beginning the recital of what I have to say about the events of the year 1810, I will set down here certain matters preserved in fragmentary notes, and which, though I cannot assign them a very precise date, nevertheless belong to a period anterior to that which I have described. The Empress Josephine had long been jealous of one of her readers, Madame Gazani, who treated her with coolness. The latter complained to the Empress, who spoke of it to Josephine, urging her to be more kindly towards her reader, whose attachment to her person deserved better treatment, and adding that she was wrong in supposing that there might still be even the slightest connection between Madame and himself. Although not convinced of the truth of this last assertion, the Empress had nevertheless ceased to avoid Madame Gazani, when one morning the emperor, who seemed to fear lest the fair Genoese might regain some influence over him, came abruptly into the apartment of the empress, saying, "I don't want to see Madame Gazani here again. She must return to Italy." This time it was the good Josephine who undertook the defense of her reader. She said to His Majesty, "You know very well, my friend, that the best means you have of delivering yourself from Madame Gazani's presence is to leave her with me. Let me keep her. We will weep together. She and I understand each other well." From that moment, the Empress was in reality extremely kind to Madame Gazani, who accompanied her to Malmaison and Navarre. She treated her all the better because she believed her to be suffering on account of the Emperor's inconstancy. For my part, I have always doubted the sincerity of Madame Gazani's attachment for the Emperor. Her self-love might have suffered when she saw herself neglected, but she easily found consolation amidst the homage and adoration which naturally surrounds so pretty a woman. In mentioning the name of the Empress Josephine, I am reminded of two anecdotes which the Emperor himself took pleasure in relating. The outrageous waste that went on in the household of the Empress was a constant source of annoyance to him, and he had forbidden certain purveyors to enter her door, knowing by experience their proneness to abuse her to easy confidence. One morning, having entered the apartment of the Empress without being expected, he found there several ladies who formed the secret council of the toilette, and a celebrated milliner who was making an official report on the costliest and most sought-for novelties. She was one of the very persons whom he had strictly forbidden to enter the palace, and he did not expect to find her there. Still, he made no fuss. And Josephine, who knew him better than anyone else, was the only one who comprehended the irony of his glance when he withdrew, saying, "Go on, ladies, I'm sorry to have disturbed you." The milliner, much astonished at not having been put rudely out of doors, made haste to retire. But on reaching the last step of the staircase leading to Her Majesty's apartments, she was accosted by an agent of the police, who invited her with all possible politeness to enter a cab, which was waiting in the court of the carousel. It was of no use for her to protest that she preferred to depart on foot. The agent, who had received precise instructions, seized her arm in a fashion which obviated all necessity for a reply. She had to obey and to take the road to the Bicêtre along with this sorry companion. News came to the emperor that this arrest had created a great scandal all over Paris, that he was loudly accused of wishing to restore the Bastille, and many persons had been to see and condole with the captive, and that a file of carriages stood in line before the door of the Bicêtre prison. His Majesty disregarded this, but was greatly amused by the interest excited, as he said, by a maker of pompons. Another time, speaking on the same subject, he said, "I shall allow these gossips who are so proud of ruining themselves for chiffons to chatter as much as they please, but I want someone to make that old woman understand that I had her put indoors because she had forgotten that I put her out of doors." Another celebrated milliner also excited the surprising anger of His Majesty by some observations which not a person in France, with the exception of this man, would have had the hardihood to make. The emperor, as I have already said, was accustomed to settle his household accounts at the end of every month. He found the bill of the milliner in question exorbitant and told me to send for him. I did so. In less than 10 minutes he came, and I introduced him into the chamber of His Majesty, who was at his toilette. "Monsieur," remarked the emperor, who had the man's bill before him, "your prices are foolish, more foolish, if that is possible, than the ninnies and dunces who fancy they have need of your industry. Reduce that bill for me in a reasonable way, or I will undertake the reduction myself." The merchant, who held a duplicate of his bill in his hand, began to justify article by article the price of his goods, and concluded this tolerably long enumeration by expressing a sort of surprise and regret that the sum total should not have been greater. The emperor, whom I was dressing while all this twaddle went on, could hardly restrain his impatience, and I already foresaw that this singular scene might have a disagreeable ending, when the man milliner capped the climax by permitting himself to remark to His Majesty that the sum he allotted for the toilette of the empress was insufficient, and that there were simple bourgeois who expended more than that. I own that I trembled for the shoulders of this imprudent person at this last impertinence, and anxiously watched the emperor's movements. However, he contented himself with crumpling in his hand the bill of this audacious milliner, and with his arms crossed on his breast, he made 2 steps towards him, saying only the one word, "Really?" with such an accent and such a look that the man rushed to the door and took to his heels without waiting for a settlement. The emperor could not endure my going to a distance from the chateau, and wanted to know that I was within reach even when my work was done, and he had no need of me. I do not know whether it was with the intention of keeping me near him, or that His Majesty sometimes desired me to do copying for him. Sometimes also the emperor, wishing to have notes taken while he was in bed or in his bath, would say to me, "Constant, take a pen and write." But I always refused, and went to summon Mr. de Meneval. I have already related how it was that the misfortunes of the Revolution had caused my primary instruction to be less carefully attended to than it should have been. But had I been as well taught as I am the reverse, I doubt very much whether I could ever have been induced to write from the emperor's dictation. Assuredly, it was not an easy task to fulfill that office. It required great practice. He talked fast, all in a breath, made no pauses, and was impatient if he were called on to repeat. In order to have me always at his disposal, the emperor gave me leave to hunt in the park of St. Cloud. His Majesty had been so kind as to notice that I was very fond of hunting, and in granting me this privilege, he deigned to tell me that he was glad to have hit upon this means of reconciling my pleasure with his convenience. I was the only person who had permission to hunt in the park. At the same time, the emperor made me a present of a superb double-barreled gun, which had been given to him at Liège, and which I have still in my possession. His Majesty did not like double-barreled guns for his own use, but availed himself of some small, single-barreled ones which had belonged to Louis XVI, and on which that monarch, an excellent gunsmith, was said to have worked with his own hands. The sight of his guns often led the emperor to speak of Louis XVI, and he never did so without feeling and expressing respect and pity for him. That unfortunate prince, said the emperor, was good, wise, and learned. At another epoch he would have been an excellent king, but he was good for nothing in a time of revolution. He lacked resolution and firmness, and could not resist either the follies of the court or the insolence of the Jacobins. The courtiers threw him to the Jacobins, who conducted him to the scaffold. In his place I would have mounted a horse, and with a few concessions on one side and a few blows of the whip on the other, I would have restored everything to order. When the diplomatic corps came to salute the emperor at St. Cloud, and the same usage existed for the Tuileries, tea, coffee, chocolate, or whatever these gentlemen asked for, was served in the salon of ambassadors. Mr. Colin, the chief steward, was present at this breakfast, which was put on the table by the apartment waiters. At St. Cloud there was a salon that the emperor was very fond of. It opened on a fine alley of chestnut trees in the closed park, where he could walk at all times without being seen. This apartment was hung with full-length, life-size portraits of all the princesses of the imperial family. It was called the family salon. Their highnesses were standing surrounded by their children. The Queen of Westphalia alone was sitting, because the upper portion of her body was very fine, as I have said before, but the rest of it less graceful. Her Majesty, the Queen of Naples, was represented with her 4 children. Queen Hortense, with only one, the eldest of her living sons. The Queen of Spain, with her 2 daughters. The Princess Elisa, with hers, dressed like a boy. The Vice Queen alone, as she had no children at that epoch. The Princess Pauline was likewise alone. During a sojourn at St. Cloud, I received a visit from a distant cousin whom I had not seen for many years. All he had heard of the luxury that surrounded the emperor and of the magnificence of the court excited his curiosity to the utmost point. I took pleasure in satisfying it. He was wonder-stricken at every step. One evening, when there was a play at the chateau, I conducted him to my box, which was on the level of the pit, and near it the spectacle afforded by the theater when it was filled enchanted my relative. I had to name every personage, for his indefatigable curiosity passed them all in review, one after the other. It was not long before the emperor's marriage with the Archduchess of Austria, and the court was more brilliant than ever. I pointed out to my cousins successively their majesties, the King of Bavaria, the King and Queen of Westphalia, the King and Queen of Naples, the Queen of Holland, their Highnesses, the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, the Prince and Princess Borghese, the Princess of Baden, the Grand Duke of Würzburg, etc., without reckoning all the dignitaries, princes, marshals, and ambassadors, of whom the hall was full. My cousin was in ecstasy, and felt taller by a foot on finding himself included in this gilded multitude. Hence he paid no attention to the play. The interior of the hall interested him far more than what was passing on the stage, and when we left the theater he could not tell me what piece had been played. His enthusiasm, however, did not carry him so far as to make him forget the stories he had heard in his own province concerning the incredible skill of the pickpockets of the capital, and the warnings given him on that head. In our excursions at the play, or any sort of assembly, my cousin guarded with anxious solicitude his watch, his purse, and his handkerchief. His habitual prudence did not desert him at the court theater. Just as we were leaving our box to mingle with the brilliant throng coming from the pit and descending from the boxes, he said to me with the greatest coolness, putting his hand over the chain and seals of his watch, "After all, it is well to take precautions. We don't know everybody here." At the time of his marriage, the emperor was still more overwhelmed than usual with petitions, and he granted, as I shall relate further on, a great number of favors and pardons. All the petitions presented to the emperor were handed by him to the aide-de-camp on duty, who took them to his majesty's cabinet, where orders were given to render him an account of them the following day. Perhaps 10 times in all I may have found some in the emperor's pockets, which I always carefully examined when there were any there. It was simply because the aide-de-camp was not at hand when they were presented. It is not true, then, though it has been said and printed, that the emperor deposited in a special pocket, which was called the good pocket, the requests he intended to grant, even without looking at them. All petitions that were worth the trouble were replied to. I have presented a great many to His Majesty. He never put them in his pocket. Nearly always I was lucky enough to find them successful. I must, however, accept several which I presented for the brothers Serf-bearer, who claimed payment for supplies furnished to the armies of the Republic. To them, the emperor was always inflexible. People said this was because Monsieur Serf-bearer had refused General Bonaparte a sum he had need of at the time of the Italian campaign. These gentlemen had greatly interested me, and I several times presented their petitions to the emperor. In spite of the pains I took never to do so, unless I saw that he was in a cheerful humor. I received no response. Nevertheless, I continued to offer him petition on petition, though I noticed that whenever he glanced at them, he was always vexed. At last, one morning, the toilet being ended, I handed him, as usual, his gloves, handkerchief, and snuff box, and again I added him this unlucky paper. His Majesty went into his study, and I remained in the chamber where I had various matters to attend to. I was busy with them when I saw the emperor returning with a paper in his hand. He said to me, "Look here, Constant, read this. You will see they are misleading you. The government owes nothing to the brothers Serf-bearer. Don't mention them to me again. They are Arabs." I glanced at the paper, reading a few words. Through obedience, I comprehended little or nothing of it, but I could not but be certain from that moment that he would never decide in favor of these gentlemen. I was distressed about it, and knowing them to be unfortunate, I offered them services which they refused. In spite of my failure to succeed, Monsieur Serf-bearer were convinced of the zeal with which I had strived for justice towards them, and thanked me for it. Every time that I presented a petition to the emperor, I saw Monsieur de Meneval, whom I would ask to concern himself about it. He was extremely obliging, and would kindly tell me whether or not my request was likely to be granted. He had said to me, apropos of that of Monsieur Serf-bearer, that he did not believe the emperor would ever allow the justice of it. And in fact, this once wealthy family, which had lost an immense patrimony in advances made to the Directory, has never obtained the liquidation it applied for, and which was confided to a man of great probity, but perhaps rather too well disposed to justify the nickname given him at this period. Madame Théodore Serf-bearer, on my invitation, had come several times with her children, both to Rambouillet and Saint-Cloud, to implore justice from the emperor. This worthy mother, whom nothing rebuffed, came once more to Compiègne with her eldest daughter in October 1811. She waited for the emperor in the forest, and having thrown herself amongst the horses, she succeeded in handing him her petition. But what came of it this time? Madame and Mademoiselle Serf-bearer had scarcely re-entered their hotel when an officer of gendarmerie came and ordered them to follow him. He made them get into a wretched cart filled with straw, and conducted them to the prefecture of police in Paris under the escort of 2 gendarmes. There they were obliged to sign an agreement never again to present themselves before the emperor, and on these conditions they were restored to liberty. An occasion in which my advances were more successful presented itself about this time. General Le Marois was one of the oldest of His Majesty's aides-de-camp, a man of tried bravery, whose excellent qualities had gained all hearts, was for a while in disgrace with the emperor, who attempted several times to obtain an audience, but whether his requests were not presented or His Majesty was disinclined to grant it, at all events, Monsieur Le Marois heard nothing from it. To know what he ought to think about it, it occurred to him to address himself to me, begging me to present his petition at an opportune moment. I was so happy as to succeed. Monsieur the Count Le Marois obtained his audience. He came away satisfied, and it was not long after that he was appointed governor of Magdeburg. The emperor was sometimes very absent-minded, and often forgot what he had done with the petitions which were returned to him when they were left in his coats. I used to take them to His Majesty's study and hand them to Monsieur Meneval and Monsieur Fain. It happened occasionally that the emperor would give me papers to lock up for him. I would then put them in a dressing case to which I had the only key. One day there was a great commotion in the interior apartments over a paper which was missing. This is how it happened. Near the cabinet of the emperor, where the secretaries were, was a little salon with a bureau on which notes or petitions were frequently deposited. It was in this salon that the cabinet usher usually remained, and that the emperor was accustomed to go in there in order to talk confidentially with persons whose conversation must not be overheard, even by His Majesty's secretaries. When the emperor entered the salon, the usher withdrew and waited at the exterior door. The responsibility for anything that might be taken from this apartment, which was never opened but by His Majesty's express orders, restored therefore upon him. Marshal Bessières had presented some days before a request for advancement for an army colonel, and given it his most earnest support. One morning the marshal entered the little salon of which I have just spoken, and finding on the bureau his recommendatory note, he saw nothing out of the way in taking it, and he carried it away with him without the fact being perceived by my wife's uncle, who was on duty. A few hours later, the emperor wished to reread this petition. He was sure he had laid it down in the little salon. It could no longer be found there. It followed that the usher must have allowed someone to enter without His Majesty's orders. It was diligently hunted for in the chamber and cabinet of the emperor and the apartments of the empress. But at last it became necessary to tell His Majesty that the search had been in vain. Then the emperor fell into one of those terrible but luckily infrequent rages which upset the whole chateau. The poor usher was ordered never to come within sight of him again. Finally, Marshal Bessières, discovering what it was all about, came and accused himself. The emperor quieted it down. The usher returned the favor, and all was forgotten. But everybody took greater pains than ever that nothing should be disturbed, and that the emperor should always find at his hand the papers he had need of. The emperor could not endure to have any person brought into his apartments or those of Her Majesty the Empress without his permission. As far as the servants were concerned, this was the only fault for which no pardon could be expected. I don't recall when it was that the wife of one of the palace porters allowed a lover that she had to enter the apartments of the empress. This wretch, without the knowledge of his imprudent mistress, took an impression in soft wax of the lock of one of the jewel cases, the one I have already mentioned as having belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette. By means of a false key made from this impression, he one day succeeded in stealing various jewels. The police soon discovered the thief, who was punished as he deserved, but another person who was also punished, who certainly did not deserve it. The poor husband lost his place. Chapter 13. The emperor seemed greatly preoccupied after his divorce from the Empress Josephine. It was known that he intended to remarry, and at the chateau of all His Majesty's attendants were talking of this future marriage. But not one of our conjectures concerning the princess destined to share the imperial crown turned out to be correct. Some had spoken of a Russian princess. Others said the emperor would marry none but a French woman. Not one had dreamed of an Austrian archduchess. When the marriage had been decided on, nothing was spoken of court but the youth, grace, and native kindliness of the new empress. The emperor seemed more cheerful and took better care of himself. He charged me to renew his wardrobe, and I ordered closer fitting and more fashionable coats for him. His Majesty sat for his portrait, which was taken to Marie Louise by the Prince de Neuchâtel. At the same time, the emperor received that of his youthful bride, and seemed enchanted with it. The emperor took more pains to please Marie Louise than he had ever done for any other woman. One day, when he was alone with Queen Hortense and the Princess Stephanie, the latter mischievously inquired if he knew how to waltz. His Majesty replied that he had never been able to get beyond the first lesson, and that after 2 or 3 turns he had been seized by a giddiness which prevented his continuing. When I was at the military school, added the emperor, I tried, I don't know how many times, to overcome the vertigo occasioned by waltzing without being able to succeed. Our dancing master had advised us when practicing to take a chair in our arms instead of a lady. I never failed to fall down with the chair, which I was squeezing affectionately, and to break it. The chairs in my room and those of 2 or 3 of my comrades disappeared one after another. This story, told in the gayest possible style by His Majesty, excited bursts of laughter from both princesses. When their hilarity had calmed down a bit, the Princess Stephanie returned to the charge and said to the Emperor, "It really is too bad that your Majesty does not know how to waltz. The Germans are crazy about waltzing, and the Empress must necessarily share in the tastes of her compatriots. She cannot have any partner but the Emperor, and hence she will be deprived of a great pleasure through your Majesty's fault." "You are right," returned the Emperor. "Very well, give me a lesson. You shall have a specimen of my savoir-faire." Therefore he rose and waltzed a few steps with the Princess Stephanie, himself humming the air of the Queen of Prussia. But he could not take more than 2 or 3 turns, and even these in such an awkward manner as to redouble the mirth of these ladies. The Princess of Baden stopped short, saying, "Sire, that is enough to convince me that you will never be anything but a bad pupil. You are made to give lessons, but not to receive them." In the early days of March, the Prince of Neuchâtel set out for Vienna to make the official demand for the Empress. The Archduke Charles espoused the Archduchess Marie-Louise by proxy for the Emperor, and she started for France without delay. The little town of Braunau on the frontier of Austria and Bavaria had been selected for the surrender of the Empress, and the Strasbourg road was soon thronged with carriages taking her new household thither. Here is a list of those persons whom it originally included. That is a long list. The majority of these ladies had passed from the household of Empress Josephine into that of the Empress Marie-Louise. The Emperor wished to see for himself whether the corbeille and the nuptial presents he intended for his new spouse were worthy of her and of him. All of the apparel, the linen, etc. was brought to the Tuileries, displayed before him, and packed up in his presence. Nothing equaled their costliness, but their elegance and good taste. The purveyors and artisans of Paris had worked from measures and models forwarded from Vienna. When these were shown to the Emperor, he picked up one of the shoes, which were remarkably small, and tapping my cheek with it by way of a caress, said to me, "Constant, the shoe bodes well. Have you seen many feet like that? One could take it in his hand." Her Majesty, the Queen of Naples, had been dispatched to Braunau by the Emperor to receive the Empress, Queen Caroline, of whom the Emperor said that she was a man among her sisters, while Prince Joseph was a woman among his brothers, was at fault. So people said about the timidity of the Empress Marie-Louise, which she mistook for weakness. She thought she had only to speak to make her young sister-in-law eager to obey. On arriving at Braunau and after the formal delivery, the Empress had dismissed her entire Austrian household, retaining only her governess, Madame de Legensky, who had educated her and who never left her. Etiquette required, however, that the new household of the Empress should be entirely French. Moreover, the Emperor's orders were precise on this head. I do not know whether it is true, as somewhere has been said, that the Empress asked and obtained the Emperor's permission to have her governess with her for a year. However it may be, the Queen of Naples thought it her own interest to banish a person whose influence over the mind of the Empress she dreaded. The ladies of the imperial household, themselves anxious to get rid of Madame de Legensky's rivalry, tried to excite still farther the jealousy of her Imperial Highness. A positive order from the Emperor was asked for, and Madame de Legensky was sent back from Munich to Vienna. The Empress obeyed without a murmur, but knowing from what hand the blow proceeded, she retained a deep resentment against Her Majesty, the Queen of Naples. The Empress journeyed only by short stages, and a fete attended her in each city through which she passed. Every day the Emperor sent her a letter written in his own hand, and she answered them regularly. The first letters of the Empress were very short and probably rather cool, for the Emperor said nothing about them, but the others grew longer and warmer by degrees, and the Emperor read them with transports of pleasure. He awaited their arrival with the impatience of a 20-year-old lover, and never found the couriers quick enough, although they rode their horses to death. The Emperor came in one day from the chase carrying in his hand a brace of pheasants which he had shot himself, and followed by several footmen laden with the rarest and most beautiful flowers from the greenhouses of St. Cloud. He wrote a note, called for his first page, and said to him, "Be ready in 10 minutes to get into a carriage. You will find this parcel there, which you You will deliver to Her Majesty the Empress with your own hand, along with this letter, and above all, don't spare the horses. Go like a page. Don't be afraid. Monsieur the Duc de Vicence will have nothing to say to you." The youth asked nothing better than to obey His Majesty. Relying on this authorization, he was lavish in tips to the postilions, and in 24 hours was in Strasbourg and had acquitted himself of his commission. I do not know whether the Grand Equerry scolded him when he came back, but if there were occasion for scolding, he would certainly have received it, notwithstanding the assurance given him by the Emperor. The Duc de Vicenza, Caulaincourt, had organized and was directing admirably the service of the stables, where nothing was done but by his will, but was of the most absolute sort. Even the Emperor found it difficult to change anything which the Grand Equerry had commanded. It happened one day, for instance, that His Majesty, who was on his way to Fontainebleau, and in great haste to arrive there, ordered the groom, whose business it was to regulate the pace, to go faster. The latter transmitted the order to the Duc de Vicenza, whose carriage preceded the Emperor's. The Grand Equerry paying no heed to it, the Emperor began to swear and shouted through the door to the groom, "Take my carriage on ahead, since the first one will not march." The grooms and postilions were about to carry out this order when the Grand Equerry in his turn thrust his head out of the door and shouted, "Trot! The first one that gallops I will dismiss when we get there." They knew very well that he would keep his word, so nobody dared to pass him, and it was his carriage which continued to set the pace. On arriving at Fontainebleau, the Emperor demanded an explanation of his conduct from the Duc de Vicenza. "Sire," he responded, "when you pare my nails a little shorter for your stable expenses, you may drive your horses to death at your ease." The Emperor was incessantly cursing the ceremonial and the fêtes which delayed the arrival of his young bride. A camp had been formed near Soissons for the reception of the Empress. The Emperor was at Compiègne, where he issued a decree containing several acts of beneficence and indulgence on the occasion of his marriage: the liberation of condemned persons, the payment of debts for child nursing, the marriage of 6 soldiers with dowries furnished by the Emperor, amnesties, institutions of majorats, etc. When His Majesty knew the Empress was in 10 leagues of Soissons, he could no longer restrain his impatience, and shouting to me with all his lungs, "Oh, Costin, order a carriage without a livery. Come and dress me." The Emperor wished to take the Empress by surprise and present himself without being announced, and he laughed like a child at the effect this interview must produce. His toilette was made with more exquisite cleanliness, if that were possible, than usual, and with the coquetry of glory he put on the great coat which he had worn at Wagram. Thus prepared, His Majesty entered a carriage with the King of Naples. How the meeting of their Majesties took place is known. In the little village of Courcelles, the Emperor met the last courier, who was only a few minutes in advance of the Empress. It was raining in torrents, and for the sake of shelter, the Emperor alighted under the porch of the village church. When the carriage of the Empress came near, the Emperor made a sign to the postilions to stop. The equerry who rode beside it, perceiving him, made a haste to lower the step and announce His Majesty, who was considerably displeased, and said to him, "Didn't you see that I signed you to be silent?" But this little spurt of ill humor vanished like a flash. The Emperor threw his arms about the neck of Marie Louise, who had a portrait of her husband in her hand, and said to him with a charming smile, looking alternately at the Emperor and his likeness, "Your portrait does not flatter you." A magnificent supper had been prepared at Soissons for the Empress and her cortege, but the Emperor ordered them to go on at once to Compiègne without regard for the appetites of the officers and ladies of Her Majesty's suite. Chapter 14. Their Majesties having arrived at Compiègne, the Emperor presented his own hand to the Empress and conducted her to her apartment. He was unwilling that any other man should approach and touch his young bride before he did, and his jealousy on this point was so delicate that he had personally forbidden Senator de Beauharnais, Chevalier of Honor to the Empress, to offer his hand to her Imperial Majesty, although this was one of the privileges of his position. According to the program, the Emperor was to leave the Empress and go into the Chancellor's residence to sleep, but he did nothing of the sort. After a long conversation with the Empress, he returned to his own room, undressed, perfumed himself with cologne water, and returned secretly to that of the Empress, clad merely in a dressing gown.